Thanks for joining me for another Todd Talk, where we take teaching theory and turn it into teaching practice. What we're going to be talking about today is an extension of a previous Todd Talk that I gave on pre-assessments. In that, I talked about the idea of giving pre-assessments to students to determine whether they've mastered content that they're going to be covering. So, for example, if you were going to be covering certain material and you give students a pre-assessment and a student gets a perfect score on the pre-assessment, they've already shown that they know what you're going to be teaching them, then what is the point of teaching them that material again? It's going to be repetitive for them. It's going to be boring. They're going to disengage. And they're not, most importantly, they're not going to be learning. And the point is that students are supposed to be learning. And so the question then becomes, what do you do once you give this pre-assessment, they've shown mastery, and they don't need to go through the material? You don't just want to give them extra work. You don't want to, and you don't want to make a ton of work for yourself. So a good solution to that is an independent project. What an independent project is you ask the student what is something they've always wanted to learn about. It can be related to the subject area you're teaching. So in other words, if they tested out of a math unit that you were going to do, is there something else about that they'd like to do or to go deeper, or something that they'd like to create using that? It could be in a social studies class. They have tested out of the Romans. Could they do a Roman project? So it can be subject related, and then just going a little bit deeper and learning about something specifically that interests them. It could be a general. So when I was teaching science, what would happen is students, if they did their independent, or they did their pre-assessment and they tested out, I would tell them, you can do anything you want as long as it has something to do with science. And so I'd have students that would do independent projects on the physics of roller coasters, how the launch angle on a baseball makes it go further, or different distances, and other such projects like that. So you can decide how you do that. You can even have it not related to your subject area, just something that they're passionate about learning about. So the way that you set up your independent project is that you do want to have structure, but you also don't want to micromanage students, because they've proven they know this material, and you're also, in addition to teaching them this content, you're teaching them independence, and you're teaching them how to learn. I've done those with third graders all the way up to seniors in high school, so it can be done with any grade level. So the structure that I like to provide, what I'm going to be talking about today, is providing them with a project contract for them to fill out. And on this, they put out there, and what you can see this link below. This is a link to blank templates for all of these documents that I'm going to be talking about, so that you can access them and use them with your students and alter them if you see fit. So a project contract is first, and on this, they indicate what they're going to be learning. They do need to have goals. What are their learning objectives? What are they supposed to be doing? The second tool that I use is a calendar. A calendar is a really good graphic organizer to help them see the big picture. So in other words, if they pre-assess and you say to them, look, I'm doing this is a 3-week unit with the other students. You have 3 weeks to complete this project. Then they're going to have to manage their time. And one way that they can do that is by using the calendar. And then lastly is, how are you going to assess them, or how are you going to assess success for this student? And the best way to do that is to have them create their own rubric, and where they set the expectations for what the project should be and what it looks like if it's excellent. Now, when I did independent projects with students, I didn't grade them as part of the grade book. And I told them that. I would say, look, I put in an A for your pre-assessment that you took. And so this is not for a grade, but I am going to provide you with feedback. It is important when they do this, they don't just do it and then nothing happens with it. It's important that they receive feedback on what they did well and what they could have done better. And so I have them create a rubric, and I show them how to do this. And they create different categories. And then what happens is I take this rubric that they created, and I hold them accountable to that rubric. And I give them an assessment. And I'll tell them, I won't give them a grade, but I'll say this was an excellent project, or this might just have been a good project, or this project needed improvement in a lot of areas. But I'm going to give them that both written feedback, and then I'm going to sit down and have a conversation with them about it, so that they have verbal feedback as well, so they can ask questions. So these are the 3 tools I'm going to be talking about more in depth today. What you see here is an example of a project contract, just one of the 3 tools that you can use to help students stay focused on their independent project. So this is used for a couple reasons. As the teacher, it's good for me to have a copy of this so I understand what the student is doing and know what they're going to be learning. The second thing it does is it acts as a graphic organizer for students so that they can keep their eyes on the prize and what it is they're supposed to be learning about. Sometimes when you work on an independent project, you can go down a lot of rabbit holes, or you can get off task, or you can get excited about something and you lose sight of something else. And so a project contract just helps students to maintain their focus on what it is they're supposed to be learning. It's just about clarity of learning, which teachers should do for students, and though in this case, students should do for themselves. And so the third thing this is a communication tool with parents. So it lets parents what is going on in the classroom, because a student comes home and parent says, "What did you do today?" And the student says, "I did this," and that doesn't make sense to the parent. This just communicates with them. You can see there's a spot at the very bottom for their signature, so that they are on board for this as well, and they know what's going on. And so the way the project, and you can find several examples of project contracts. This is just one of them. And again, you can access all three of these templates at the link that I provided. But basically, students would put their name. They put the project name. So let's say you have a unit on space, and a student has pre-assessed and got 100%, and so they're well beyond the basics of what you're going to be teaching. And so you ask them, what is something you've always wanted to learn about space, or something you'd always wanted to know? And so they may have, come up with the idea of, will people eventually go to Mars? And so that would be the focus of their particular project. And so then they would come up with learning objectives. So this is what are they going to learn about this particular project. So one thing, obviously, they're going to learn if they're going to Mars is life sustainable on Mars, and what would that look like? So obviously, I'm a teacher, and so coming up with these learning objectives are not as difficult. But basically, these are just the essential questions that a student is wondering, that they are asking. So you'll have to guide them, but students are pretty good at coming up with these on their own as well, because it's just the thoughts and the questions that they have in their own minds, just articulated on this project contract. One thing that they would want to, not only is life sustainable on Mars and what that would look like, they want to see what's already been done. So what progress has been made toward living on Mars? So they could look at Elon Musk's work. They could, there's a lot of people who are doing things already. So the student doesn't need to reinvent the wheel. They just need to find out what is going on and kind of tap into that and learn from that. And so they would want to do that. And a third thing that they would want to know, a learning objective, is what would a viable plan, plan. So what they would do is the student would then, from the information that they've gathered, they would try to say, this is the plan of what this would look like if we were going to live on Mars. So these are the learning objectives, and these are the focal points for the project for the student. And you can see there's lots of things with space in there. They have to learn a lot about Mars in order to do that. So when it comes to skills, they're going to have to do research. They probably already know this, but they're going to learn how to do research. Is a skill they'll be using. They may do an interview. So they may interview someone who's, like, if there's an astronomy professor from a local university, or it doesn't have to be local. In today's day and age with Skype and Zoom and all that, they could talk to someone from across the world, but maybe they are able to track down an expert on this and able to have a conversation with them. So that could be another skill. And then depending upon what their actual product of the project is going to be. So let's say, for the sake of argument for this one, their eventual product is that they're going to make a pitch to a group of investors as to what they're going to do, what this how they're going to travel to Mars, what that's going to look like, how much it's going to cost, and things like that. So they're going to have to learn public speaking as another skill learned. So, and there are other skills that, and as the student is going through, they may discover something else that they're learning, and they just may add that to the contract. But this is our initial thoughts on the contract. So, the overall goal of this project. So, this is a personal goal of what the student wants to do. So, what is it that they want to learn about? So, in this case, the student obviously is interested in space travel, and so they may say the overall goal is to determine whether it is possible to expand space travel to other planets. So this isn't just about Mars necessarily. This is about just space travel in general, and what that would look like. So that would be their overall goal. So if they figure out a way to live on Mars, is there, are there other possibilities for people to live on? So the product of the project, like I said before, they come up with several things. And so I give them like a list of choices of what they can do. So they could write a research paper, they could create a website, they could create a video. In this case, I'm going to have them, they're going to, I'm not going to have them, they're going to present to a group of investors their plan for going to Mars. So that would be the product. So this is, and I like this product, and I would steer students towards a product such as this because it's authentic. So obviously the investors are not real. They're just going to be adults who are interested in this, or, who knows? In some cases, maybe they could be a venture capitalist and you're creating, some kind of program that they would be interested in. But for the most part, you're setting up this authentic audience of adults, and this person will role play as though they are investors, and they'll have to make their pitch. So this makes it really authentic. This makes it real world. This is something that students might have to do when they become adults and are in the working world. And so I like this product. And so I would steer kids towards this. If a kid said, if this is a high school kid and they say, I want to make a poster, I probably would steer them away from that. But at the same time, if they can make a decent argument for why doing a poster would be, a viable option, then I would certainly listen to that. But students in this contract are not only kind of laying out the project for themselves, but they're laying it out for me, the teacher, as well, so that I can make sure that what it is they're doing is a good use of their class time. This last one is the categories for the rubric evaluation, and I'll get to that when I talk about the rubric. But basically, the rubric will be broken down into parts, and so these are just the different parts that they're going to be evaluated on. When I do independent projects, I very rarely actually grade them for a grade in the grade book. I just give the student the mastery of the content standards that they covered through their pre-assessment. And then this just acts as, I just provide feedback. I provide both verbal and written feedback so students can learn from this experience and not really focus on the grade necessarily, because the grade doesn't matter. Although one thing I've found with these independent projects is that when there's no grade attached, students will work harder because it's something that they're really interested in or passionate about, or that they can sink their teeth into. And so the grade does not need to be a carrot dangled over them for them to do good work. The good work is the engagement and the level of, excitement that they have by working on something of their own doing. And so you also see at the bottom there's a spot for the signatures for the student and for the teacher. And so the student would fill this out, and then we would sit down together and we would have a conversation. We would have a conference, and they would kind of pitch me on what their project is going to be. And I would give feedback here or there. I would say, well, you might want to, so I might, in this case, with the learning objectives, I might say, they might have to do a little bit of more background. So, what was the trip to the moon? All right, what did trip to the moon encompass? So they may have to do a little bit of background uh, research to find out what has happened before when it came to space travel to the moon. So I may add that in there just as something I think would be interesting and would give them some background. And like I said, so you don't write them for them. You just try to help them shape them. So you would ask probing questions. So I would have said, instead of saying, "Why don't you add this? Why did the trip? What does the trip to the moon encompass?" I would say, "Well, what space travel have we done already, and what did that look like?" And then they may come up with that learning objective as a result. And then again, I look at that goal and the product, and if that all passes the litmus test, then I sign, they sign, and then I make sure that they take it home, get their parents to sign off on it so that the parents are aware what's going on. Student brings it back. I make a copy. I make 3 copies. I have one for me, I have one for the student, and I have one for the parents to have. And so that is what a project contract would look like for working on an independent project. This is the second tool that you can use with students when they're doing independent projects, which, as you can see, is just a blank calendar. But you would be surprised as to the effectiveness of this as a tool and how it keeps kids on track, how it helps them to see the big picture. I think that's the biggest advantage of all, is that this really allows them to see the entire thing in front of them, because sometimes we don't look at the entire picture. And so what this looks like is you either the student a deadline. So you say you have 2 weeks to work on this, or you have 3 weeks to work on this, or you have however long to work on this, and then they plan accordingly. And then they have to make sure that they're not filling their days with too much, because they won't be able to get done in time. So they have to learn how to pace themselves. And so I often teach students to backwards build. In other words, to start with the end in mind and then to go from there. So, for example, I'm going to start at the very end of my calendar here. And this is where students, so that's, and say in the case of our example, the student is going to present to the panel his plan for what it means to go, or for his plan to go to Mars and what that would look like. And so then from there, all the planning becomes built upon the end. And so it builds and builds and builds and builds. For example, in order to present to the panel, you want to practice the day before so that you've got everything worked out and refined. So hopefully you have someone that will help you with what it is that you're doing, and give you feedback on how you can make it better. So on that day, you may practice and then refine it. Before you are going to practice the presentation, you actually have to have your presentation. So more than likely, the student will use a visual aid. So this would be complete PowerPoint for presentation. And this may take a few days. So they can just simply work on this for 3 days, possibly. So, and keep in mind, I always tell students that this calendar is not written in stone necessarily. They may be able to finish their PowerPoint in a day. It may take them 4 days. They're going to have to adjust to that, but this just gives them a general outline of how much time they have to work with. So in order to work on a PowerPoint, they actually have to have the presentation part aspect of it. So this would be work on presentation. So this is kind of the writing of the presentation and maybe having index cards. So that may take a few days to actually work on the presentation, and what that's going to look like. So, and part of that, you can even be more specific. So this is where they're going to write presentation, and then work on those, continue on writing those. So that would take maybe a few days. So in order to have the presentation, they have to have information. So this would be gathering information into bite-size info bits. So what this means is they're not going to be able to dump all this research on someone. They're going to have to break it down. And so this would be kind of at the end result of their research. They take all of their research and kind of synthesize it into these bite-sized info bits that they can use to present to people. In order to have that information, they've had to have researched. So research may take the longest amount of time. So they may research for several days. Part of that research might be conducting an interview. So calling or Skyping with someone who knows something about this, or this research is going to, and you'll have to you give the students some independence, but you may have to guide them on what doing good research looks like. It depends on the student themselves. You may just be able to leave them alone and they go to town on this. There may be other students that need a little more guidance. So it's all a matter of knowing your student and what they're capable of. So you're doing the research, so the research is going to take several days. It, keep in mind, we have to consider our objectives that we had. So we also have to, in addition to the research on Mars, so I'm going to put this more specifically so that I know what that research is looking at. We talked about the one that I suggested to the student adding, which is researching the moon. So researching travel, and that may only take a couple days just to get like a general idea, read some articles, what that looks like. And so so as we're building this backwards, we presented the panel, we had to practice our presentation, we had to create a PowerPoint, we had to actually make the presentation, we had to have information to put into the presentation, we had to have research that this information comes from, both from Mars and from the moon. And then then you figure out what is there anything else that you need to do. So this might be just a general search for resources. So students are going to be kind of pinpointing what their resources are going to be that they're going to be using. So that may take a few days. And then here is starting project. So you can see how we backwards built into this. And now we're going to go forward and take a look at it. So we're going to start our project on going to Mars. So this is going to be an idea of, and this is going to actually look like working on contract, calendar, and rubric. That's what that looks like. So that's just the student sitting down and figuring out what it is they're going to be doing, and what you have worked out together. Then once they have their learning objectives and their skills, they're going to start their general search for resources. Then they're going to research specifically on how we traveled to the moon and what we did to do that. Then they're going to take a look at the recent research on Mars. And then they're going to take all this information they researched and kind of break it down into info bites so that they can put that into a presentation. So they're going to spend a few days writing and working on their presentation, a few days creating a PowerPoint, because visuals are always a nice medium. They don't have to do that. That would be their choice. So if they chose not to do that, you just eliminate those days. And then you have a practice presentation, and then they're presenting to the panel. And so now the student, and the product is a presentation to panel. So now what the student has effectively done is kind of mapped out what this is going to look like. Again, they may get into this and find that they need more days for some things and less days for others. But what this does is kind of gives them a guideline. So they know if they get to the fifth day and they're still looking at general resources, then do they need to spend more time on that, or do they have enough? Do they have to evaluate what they have? When they're doing their research on Mars, their interview, they have to be at the whim of the person that can do the interview. So it may happen on a day other than what they had planned, and that's perfectly okay. So this is a malleable calendar. You can move it around. But it's a really good way to keep students on track. It's a really good way to make sure that they are following a timeline of what they need to be doing to be successful in this product. And it allows them the independence that you're giving them, because by doing this, you kind of get an idea what they're doing. You don't have to keep an eye on them as much as you would if this were a typical student in a typical classroom working on a typical assignment. In this case, you can turn students loose on this and just observe from afar. Are they doing their research? Are they working on their presentation or whatever? And you can follow along with that calendar so that you're not completely cut out of the loop, but at the same time, you're giving students the space in order to work independently and learn those skills from working independently. The third tool that I use with students when they're working on independent projects in order to keep them focused is a rubric. So this rubric is not created by me. This is a student created rubric. Because they've set the expectations for what they want to learn, they're also going to set the expectations for how that's going to be assessed, whether it's successful or not. And so what I do is I show students how to create their own rubric and then let them do that. And then I coach them along the way. This is what, you can add this, or you might want to consider this, or you might want to get rid of that. But basically, the student is setting the expectations for what the project is going to be. And so this is an example of a project rubric, a blank project rubric template. And so how I always teach kids is I tell them to break it down into parts. So in this case, when we're looking at our mission to Mars, we're going to be looking at content. So how good is the content? And this is the information in their presentation, the information that they're giving. Does it seem reliable? Things of that nature. There also is going to be the presentation aspect of it. So they are giving a presentation, and this could be broken down in a couple of things. It could be, if they're going to have an accompanying PowerPoint, you could include that, but you could also separate that out. And so I could see them very easily separating out the PowerPoint and putting that as a separate. Because that would be really important. And so I've broken down this into, and keep in mind what you don't see in here is I'm not evaluating the days that they're doing the research, because that shows itself in the content. If they've done the research that they're supposed to do, that will appear when they're giving their presentation and when they're giving that information to the panel. And I've been observing all along how well they've been doing research and what that looks like, and coaching them from here and there. But for the most part, they are working on their own, and they understand that this information is being gathered so that they can put it into their presentation. So now that I have my 3 categories, I have to take a look holistically. Does that do all my learning objectives? So I think it does. When you look at the learning objectives that we came up with, you can certainly capture all of those in this. So now that you have your those categories, we also have to take a look at what these categories look like. I always tell kids to show me what it looks like. Don't tell me what it looks like. So don't say content is excellent, which I've seen some teachers have a rubric like that. What does excellent content look like? So in this case, content seems reliable and from multiple reputable sources. So if they're using NASA, if they're using the Smithsonian, if they're using the Discovery Channel, those are all really reputable ones. If they only use one source and it comes from some crackpot that doesn't seem to have any relevance, then that's a problem. So in this case, the content seems reliable and from multiple reputable sources. And how they might show that, and it's conveyed in a resources slide. So they've actually said, okay, they have their information at the very end. They have this resource slide that tells where they got it from. So that would be showing me that. In addition, the content needs to be detailed. Plan. And this is the content of the plan. Plan is detailed. The specific examples and why you made those decisions. Now, keep in mind, I've written rubrics. I've written hundreds and thousands of rubrics, so this is easy for me. Students depending upon the student, it might be a little more challenging. So may have to provide some training. And what I have here is a link to a tutorial that I have for how to make your own rubrics, which you're more than welcome to use with students. It's a 10-minute tutorial, and it kind of walks them through what this looks like. Because I'm not going to write this entire rubric together. I just want to give you an idea what that looks like. So I've got my plan as detailed, as specific examples on why I made those decisions. So those might be what that looks like. A presentation in this regard, I may give them a time limit. So I may say, you can't take forever. I'm giving you 15 minutes. So in this case, presentation uses its 15 minutes well. What does that look like? It doesn't go over or under by much and conveys the information. So that's what that looks like. So I have to show, and I just can't say it's 15 minutes, because you could have 15 minutes of crap. You could have 15 minutes of, wandering around and not making any sense. So I want to make sure that I put like a tag on this to let you know that it's not just 15 minutes. It's 15 minutes that conveys the complete information. It gives you the big picture of what that looks like. I could add other things to the presentation as well. It could be that the volume or tone that students use, or do they dress professional? Do they seem organized? There's all sorts of things that students could put in there, and they'll decide those for themselves. But similarly on the PowerPoint. So if I'm looking at my PowerPoint here, this might be the visuals. Visuals included are meaningful, add to the content. So I just don't want them to have a picture of a rocket going to Mars. I want them to, some kind of clip art. I want them to have visuals that are going to be meaningful. And so, I don't just want that they need to have that if it's going to be an effective presentation. So students may say, when they're writing their initial rubric, they may say, I have visuals. And I would push back, and that's where the coaching comes in. I would push back and say, well, what kind of visuals? What do these visuals look like? Show me. Don't just tell me that you're putting visuals. Show me what these visuals look like. And keep in mind, we're in the excellent realm right here. So we're describing what it looks like if it's excellent. The PowerPoint, I think PowerPoints need to have a flow to them. So PowerPoint has a flow to it. And what this looks like with each slide leading into the next. So that I've not just said what it is, I've not just said it flows, I'm saying what that flow looks like. So you have to remind students when they're writing anything, whether it's a rubric or story or whatever, to show, don't tell. And so that's a really valuable skill for students to learn. You may have another aspect where in addition to the flow of it, slides contain appropriate amount of text. So what I mean by that is there's a certain balance. You don't want to have, and I would actually put this in my presentation to help with this part, presented to the panel confidently, not read. So one of the big things I see students do when they're doing a presentation is they tend to read the slides, which is incredibly boring and not very engaging. So we have this, you see how this puts together the big picture. The slides contain an appropriate amount of text. What that means is also that when they're presenting to the panel, they're not reading all that text, they're presenting their bullet points. And so I would work with students, and we may look at exemplars for what really good presentations look like or what really good PowerPoints look like. But again, if the student feels confident to doing that on their own, then you just turn them loose to do that. But these are just nuanced ways that you can coach the student with certain things. So then you would create this at the good level, which is showing what it looks like, where it's good but not excellent. And I always use the word but in there in order to convey that. So in other words, if I take this very first one and I put content seems reliable and from multiple sources for most parts, but a couple seem sketchy. Let's talk like a student. And then I would still have the conveyed in a resources slide. So I use but. And this one, it may be, I'm using the word not to convey that. So content does not seem reliable or from multiple reputable sources or is not conveyed in a resources slide. So they're just missing their slide altogether. So I have my word not in this one. That just kind of changes that a little bit. And I wordsmith here and there. And then this one uses a but in order to kind of take it down to the next level. But again, these need to kind of run into one another. So in this case, if it needs improvement because it's not reliable, well, here it would be somewhat reliable, and here it would be very reliable. But you can't just put it's very reliable. You have to say what that looks like. You can't just say somewhat reliable. What does somewhat reliable look like? So you want to make sure students are using that to show what it is. So this is just a very basic example of a rubric. Like I said, with some students may have a good grasp on this, some others may need some coaching. You can always give them examples of rubrics, and then they can use those. Do not let them use something like Rubistar, which is an automatic rubric generator, which makes really general and vague rubrics. And so we want the student to make this for themselves. And they may put things in the rubric that are specific to them. So in the presentation part, this is a student that in the past when they do presentations, and ah a lot. Then they might want to put that in specifically to them. They may say presentation is clear, no ums and ahs. Or let's just say not no, but we want to give them some room. Very few ums and ahs. So we don't want to make it so. I mean, because the one thing you have to be careful is that the excellent is not perfect. There's no such thing as perfect project. It's not, that's unattainable. But it has few ums and ahs. Or you could even make it so instead of very few, you could just put a couple. If you put contains some ums and ahs, you have to be careful because the word some could convey 2 ums and ahs. It could convey 30 ums and ahs, and 30 ums and ahs is definitely not in the excellent range. So that's what the rubric looks like. That is a structure that you can use with students to provide them with guidance and to help them to focus. This is designed for gifted students, to whereas if they pre-assess out that they can do these independent projects, but these work with any students. So you may have students that typically don't do well in your class, but there's something that they're very passionate about, and they already know quite a bit of information about it. Well, again, you shouldn't have any kid, gifted or not, sit through material that they've already heard or they already understand. And so what an independent project allows them to do is to go deeper into that and to learn and to be learning in the process rather than just hearing something that they already have learned.